So yeah, I work for a little charity called Stormwater Shepherds, and we are focused completely on pollution from urban surfaces. And any of you that know me from LinkedIn or other social media will know that my particular passion is pollution from highway runoff, much to the horror of the highway authorities, who frankly would rather I shut up and left, but I'm not going to. We're going to talk this evening about why I care, why I get so cross about highway runoff pollution. I'm going to debunk the first flush principle just in case anybody is still thinks it's a thing, because it's not for highway runoff. And then we'll talk a little bit. I have to say, I live in Lancashire. I worked for the Environment Agency for 28 years in Lancashire. So chalk streams are not an area I know a lot about because we don't have any. Although I have done quite a lot of work with partners on the River Chess and some of the other watercourses, chalk streams north of London. I've tended to do work, and I did do quite a lot of work with the Aquifer Partnership, looking at chalk stream restoration as well. So doing a little bit. And then I will talk about solutions. I get told off for being grumpy and always talking about problems. So I've promised that there are some slides at the end that are sets out solutions and how we can fix this problem. So part of the reason everybody suddenly was interested in this, along with other things, was there was a lot of press coverage. This is a couple of years ago now, about decline in freshwater fish populations in British rivers. And about the same time, the Americans discovered something called 6-ppd quinone, which was a chemical that leaches out of tire wear particles and kills salmon, or it kills American salmon. I got in touch with the Environment Agency when this information was published, and was quite widely reported around America and the UK, and said to the Environment Agency, look, we must panic. And they said, oh, it's all right, it only kills American fish. So they didn't panic, and I was panicking. Subsequently, it has been proven to affect other fish, other species of fish. So we know that tire wear particles are a problem. We're just not entirely sure how big of a problem, but we know it's quite big. Aside from that sort of new science that was being revealed, this had been my day-to-day bread and butter work for several years already. And that image on the right sums it up for me, really. That is a concrete slip-form drainage channel on the M6 in Cheshire. And it was built when they did the Smart Motorway programme on that stretch of the M6. From an engineering point of view, it's a very satisfactory drainage device because it conveys the water off the carriageway very quickly, and it whooshes it down into the drainage network, never to be seen again. From a water quality point of view, it's probably the worst possible type of drainage infrastructure because it, as you can see there, captures the pollutants, and then when it rains hard, whooshes them all straight into the river, and with them all the pollutants that we're about to talk about. So that was built in, I don't know, 2020, probably, something like that. This is a massive problem. It's been a problem for 50 years, and we're still creating the problem. We're not even building new schemes properly, so we're still causing the problem. So when it rains, it whooshes off the motorway. This is a discharge off the M62 near Leeds in a place called Cleckheaton. And for those of you who are familiar with water quality and water regulation, that pipe coming in the middle of the screen is a watercourse in law. It's a small tributary of the local river. And so the legislation requires that it is protected from pollution by the environmental regulator, and it isn't. And it takes all the runoff from the far carriageway of the M62, and that little pipe on the right-hand side brings the runoff from the near carriageway of the M62. And this is a massive problem because that watercourse has a legal protection, and the highway runoff causes gross pollution every time it rains. And I like this image, and from a chalk stream point of view, this image is particularly important. This is what's in that runoff. So when we take samples of runoff, there is a high sediment load, sometimes as much as 500 or 600 milligrams per litre. And when we catch that sediment, which is what we've done in this image here, you can see that it's this nasty black toxic sludge. And that's one outfall in a town called Wigan in Lancashire. And though we think there are 1 million outfalls nationally off the highway network, there are 25,000 outfalls off National Highways network alone. and then there's all the other roads. And so that sediment, that black sludge, is going into rivers all across the UK every time it rains. And we'll talk in a minute about the toxicity of it, but from your point of view, the fact that it's a fine sediment is a massive problem for chalk streams, because it settles out on the bed of the chalk stream and fills in the spaces between the chalk gravel, and then affects spawning grounds and also any benthic invertebrates living in there, and also affects that interface between the rising groundwater and the chalk stream. So a massive problem, and one that we're not doing enough about. But also in that runoff, as well as the sediment, you've got polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are the derivatives from fuel oils, and also they come out of your tyres. You've got toxic metals in huge quantities, particularly copper and zinc. You've got the microplastic tire wear particles that we've already mentioned, and you've got quite a lot of organic pollution. The toxic metals and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons are recognised as priority hazardous substances and hazardous substances under the Water Framework Directive. They've got this designation as being hazardous substances because they have measurable hazard to the creatures that live in the watercourse. And so they have standards that you mustn't breach. And frankly, every time I sample highway runoff, it breaches the standards. This is what keeps me awake at night. So these pollutants, they cause mutations and deformities. They affect various metabolic functions of the creatures. They affect their behavior, so they can't run away from predators. They can't chase food, so they fail to thrive and fail to grow. It affects reproduction, so it affects the active reproduction. It affects the health of the embryos. It affects the success of the eggs. It causes abortions. They're carcinogenic, these pollutants. They cause failure to grow, failure to mature, and they can cause death. Frankly, if we know as a nation that we're putting pollutants into our rivers that do that every time it rains, it's horrific that we're doing nothing about it. Part of the reason we're doing nothing about it is because nobody's measuring it. So the Environment Agency don't measure for polyaromatic hydrocarbons downstream of highway discharges. Nobody's measuring the effect on the invertebrates of these discharges. Nobody's taking the invertebrates and looking at them. We count them and we can see reductions in population diversity downstream of highway runoff, but nobody's actually looking at them to see if they're smaller or deformed or have a higher parasitic load. So this massive problem, and it frankly is a massive problem, is completely overlooked because nobody's measuring it. And nobody wants to measure it, because if they quantify it and reveal the magnitude of the problem, somebody will have to pay for the solution. But it's bigger than that, because those insects that live in our rivers, a huge proportion of them are river flies. And those river flies hatch, and I've no doubt most of you have seen this, particularly in the chalk streams, and they create a food source for birds and bats and other creatures. So if we're decimating our population of river flies, that's having a huge knock-on effect to the wider ecosystem. And also there's a bioaccumulation of some of the toxins. So the insects have metals in them, and the fish eat the insects, and then the the birds, the dippers, and the dippers eat the insects, the kingfishers eat the fish. So some of the pollutants go up the food chain and bioaccumulate. Now, I have to make a declaration. I'm not a hydrogeologist. I'm sure there are people in the room who know more about chalk than I do, but I do know a bit about groundwater protection. There is research that National Highways are very fond of. One piece of research that says that if you put highway runoff into the ground, one of those samples they took was chalk, it's fine, because all the pollutants are captured in the top few centimeters of soil, and they're all biodegraded, and the metals are captured and they assimilate. You can do it forever and it's fine. My stomach tells me that's not true. My 28 years of environment protection mean a little alarm bell is going off in my head going, that's not true. The research was flawed. It's one piece of research. And I would dearly, dearly love for somebody else to do more work on that. What I think happens is that people measure the pollutants in the top layer and find all the pollutants, and they go, look, all the pollutants are here. And then they measure further down in the substrate and they go, it's fine, there's no pollutants here. What nobody is measuring is the movement of those pollutants through the substrate when it's raining. So if the pollutants are to some extent getting captured at the surface, but some of them are going straight through the substrate into the underlying groundwater, then we've got a problem, and nobody's measuring that problem. And I quite like this image of the famous white cliffs, because the other thing to remember is on a lot of the chalk, and indeed on the limestone up in Cumbria, there's very little soil. So it's all very well saying it's all right because the top 10 centimetres of soil will deal with all the pollution like magic. But if you haven't got 10 centimetres of soil, your magic is lost and you don't get that pollution prevention. So I think if anybody in the room wants to do more research on this, I'd love you forever, because I think this needs more research. This is a drainage ditch at the side of the A3M in a place called Waterlooville. But this drainage ditch takes all the runoff from the A3M straight into the chalk. And the little rubber berms are intended to hold the water back to encourage it to go down into the chalk. I've never taken a sample of the runoff from the A3M, but I can tell you without any doubt in my mind that that runoff will fail the environmental quality standard for all the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and for copper and zinc. And so that discharge to ground with an exceedance of the environmental quality standard for polyaromatic hydrocarbons, as far as I know, and I know a bit, is illegal. It's strictly, in strict liability terms of legislation, that's an illegal discharge. It's a groundwater discharge activity and it should be permitted. And it's not. And it's going on all across the country. The other thing that is a problem for your chalk streams, and this is something, again, I don't really deal with up in the northwest of England, is you have this inundation, so you have water coming up from below. You also have this problem, and this is a quote from a couple of years ago, actually, lady from Southern Water. And the reason I like this is it intrigued me, was she said the winter weather has been truly extreme. The Nailbourne River in Canterbury is flowing again, something that it hasn't done since 2016. Winterbournes are alien to me. We don't really have them. But if you imagine that national highways have designed a discharge into a winterbourne and they've assumed that it has flow all year round, they've assumed that the runoff is diluted because that's what they do in their risk assessment model, then that process is flawed. Because even if that winterbourne runs dry for one day of the year, the next time it rains, that runoff goes straight into the aquifer. And the model should reflect that, and it doesn't. It can, if somebody does the modelling really well, it can, but I can be almost certain that there are discharges off the motorway network in this country that go into chalk streams that run dry at certain times of the year. And that means that if you get a summer storm washing the motorway runoff that's been building up for 2 or 3 weeks of dry weather, and it goes straight into the chalk, you've got a massive pollution problem that for some reason nobody's paying any attention to. So there are solutions, and they're not that difficult. They're engineering wise and design wise, they're not that complicated. So we've talked about the pollutants that are in this road runoff. And what you need to remember for designing treatment is that we separate the two types of pollution. So we have the suspended solids and we have the dissolved pollutants, and they're two different entities when it comes to designing a treatment scheme. The suspended solids are really, really good. They want to settle out. So this is a discharge off the M60 in a place called Worsley near Manchester. And this is an outfall structure. This is not a treatment structure. This is just the outfall structure. And that pipe brings highway runoff off the motorway into a little ditch in the woods every time it rains. But because of the way it's been designed and constructed, the water pools here at the outfall before it goes down the ditch. And that is about 6 to 8 inches of settled sediment, because the water has rested and the sediment has settled, because that's what it wants to do. So treating that sediment is quite straightforward. You just have to let the runoff rest in a sediment separator or a vortex grit separator or a sediment forebay. Let the runoff rest and the sediment will do that for you. And that has in it all the metals, most of the metals, most of the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, most of the microplastic tire particles, and most of the nutrients. So if you can get that out, you've done 80% of the work, and it's relatively easy. The dissolved pollutants aren't quite so easy. So this bottle on the left is a bottle of highway runoff that I took a few years ago now, actually, probably about 10 years ago. And the bottle in the middle is just another sample. And the bottle on the right has been filtered through a 0.45 micron filter. So the gentleman I was with from Lancashire County Council was very excited. He said, "Oh, look, we fixed it." I was a little bit less enthused because we haven't fixed it. You can see in the third column there, the figures in red are the dissolved copper and the dissolved zinc in that bottle. So they still fail environmental quality standards even after it's been filtered because the levels of dissolved pollutants are sufficiently high. So we do have to remember that we take out the sediments, but that's not everything. You do need to have provision for some of the removal of the dissolved metals. It's hard and it's expensive, and we probably can't do it all, but we have to try. And the other thing you have to remember is this. So these samples were taken from a discharge into the River Ribble in Preston on the 9th and 11th of March, and it is nearly 10 years ago. I thought it was. You don't need to worry too much about the numbers. The point that's important is every one of those fails the environmental quality standard quite significantly. So the environmental quality standard is shown there in the fourth column for those polyaromatic hydrocarbons. What's important about this slide is it had already been raining for over an hour before we got there on both occasions. So when people say to you, well, we'll just treat the first 10 millimetres, or we'll just treat the first flush, or we'll just treat the first 15 minutes. No, they won't. Not for highway runoff. That works for a school playground. It works for a pedestrian area outside Marks and Spencer's where you'll quickly wash the pollution off when it rains. It doesn't work for motorways. It doesn't work for roads because the two reasons. One is that the drainage infrastructure on roads is very long and thin, so the pollution has to travel from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, and that can sometimes take 2 hours. But also, if you think about a school playground, when it's raining, nobody's causing any pollution because nobody's playing. But on a motorway or a road, when it's raining, the pollution is still there because everybody's still driving. And in fact, it's probably worse because it's washing the gunge off their cars. So remember, if you're ever talking to design engineers about treating pollution from highway runoff, don't let them tell you that they're going to treat the first flush because there is no such thing. It lasts for hours. And so what are the treatment options? This is a place called Stover Park near Exeter, if anybody knows it. And National Highways spent about £3 million in 2019 building 2 treatment systems on either side of a watercourse. Two sediment traps like this, which they then concrete line, and then 2 reed beds. The jury's out a little bit at the moment about the reed beds because they're not doing what we wanted them to do, but there's definitely signs of recovery in the lake downstream since this treatment scheme was built. So that's good news. That's just an image of the sediment trap after they finished it. Something I'll talk about a little bit later is that's a good device. It's a big device. It's got good residence time, so the sediment will settle and it will work as long as they empty it every 4 or 5 years. I'm slightly disconcerted by the fact that that then creates a habitat for wildlife, but it's full of toxins. And we do this a lot with highway runoff. We build things that will deal with the toxic pollution and allow sedimentation, but we build them such that they are habitats for wildlife. And this is in a nature reserve. So you've got birds and wildfowl and bats and all sorts of creatures. And if they're coming down to drink from that when it's raining or just after it's rained, that water will be poisonous. And I have a problem with that. Some of the other options are more engineering, and I suppose I would argue they're better because they isolate the pollution from the environment completely. But I get told off for saying that because I'm sponsored by a product manufacturer. My charity is sponsored by a product manufacturer. Regardless of that, these things work and they isolate the pollution from the environment. So I think this is a better solution. There are 2 types on the market. This is a Vortex grit separator, the one in the image. This is manufactured by a company called Hydro International. They're very famous for this device. And it's like a Dyson cleaner. So it spins the stormwater around as it comes in, and then the sediment settles out at the bottom. You can see in the image there. And then the clean air water goes forward into a pond or a basin or a wetland where it can get more treatment. These things are about 15 to 35 grand, depending on how big you need them to be. And you empty them once a year and it costs you about 700 quid. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is an ethical and honest way of treating urban runoff and highway runoff. What happens is people say, well, we haven't got the money to maintain it. well, you have to maintain it because it's a pollution treatment device and therefore it must be maintained. And indeed, all pollution treatment devices need to be maintained. My retort to that is if you put one of those in and empty it every year, it'll cost you maybe £100,000 to put it in by the time you've dug the hole. £700 to £1,000 a year to empty forever. If you don't put it in and you build a big pond, you'll do nothing for 20 years. It'll then cost you £1 million to £1.5 million to have your pond emptied. And that's likely to be hazardous waste. So if you actually do the mathematics, it's cheaper to do this and it's better for the environment. And so I spend a lot of my time arguing with engineers about the glory of a sediment removal device. There are other ones on the market that are sort of short and fat and horizontal, called sediment separators, that just work slightly differently but do something very similar. So this is an oil water separator. So same philosophy, except this one doesn't spin round, it rests. So the stormwater rushes in on the left and then rests in that vessel. It's designed to have a residence time of several minutes. And then the sediment separates in the first chamber, as you can see, and then the second chamber removes any hydrocarbons. That's just an alternative version. The other thing that I really, really love, and I get told off for this as well, is filter drains. I think they're fantastic, but the Romans invented them. So everybody, tuts at me and says, well, they've been around since Roman times. So how can they possibly still be the best thing since sliced bread? But I love filter drains. This is a filter drain on the M6 toll in the Midlands. The philosophy of these things is you've got 500 to 700 millimeters of stone, single-sized stone, at the side of the carriageway. The runoff comes off the side of that motorway and straight into that filter drain. And the sediment separates out in the gaps between the stones. And you can add a layer, I'll show you in a minute, you can add a layer that captures the dissolved metals. The reason that is so fantastic is if you go back to this, that might have a treatment volume of, I don't know, 40 cubic meters, let's say, at the end of the pipe at the bottom of the hill. So remember 40 cubic meters. If you've got a kilometre of this on both sides of the carriageway, you've got 2,000 cubic meters of treatment capacity. So they are a fantastic option if you've got the right ground conditions and the right space and an engineer that will do it for you. On the chalk, you'd have to line that and you'd have a perforated pipe in the bottom to take the water further forward and either it straight into the river or into a pond. But it's still a fantastic option. And as I say, you can add a layer. This one says STS Aqua Exchange, but there are 2 or 3 on the market now of treatment media that will capture the dissolved metals. So all of a sudden, you've got a device that doesn't cost very much. It takes out all the sediment, it takes out the dissolved metals, it attenuates the flow and reduces flood risk, and it's dead simple to put in, and it doesn't need much maintenance. So I like them. I don't like these quite so much. This is a stormwater filter. So this one's about 11 meters long by about 4 meters round. So these are big. This is a downflow stormwater filter, and they've got that treatment media in bags in the middle of where the yellow thing is. They're brilliant, but they're flipping expensive and they're a pain to maintain. So only use these if you really need them. So if you're discharging your road runoff into a stream that's got pearl mussels in it, or if you're discharging your road runoff into a stream that's got white club crayfish in it, then you might need one of these, but you really are only going to use them when you really need them. That's an upflow filter. Same sort of philosophy, except the water in this one comes down at the left, spins around a bit to put some of the sediment in the bottom, and then it goes up through the filter, which is that pinky coloured cartridge. They're a pain to maintain as well. So only use them if you really, really need them. If you've got that treatment media that I mentioned before, it looks a bit like cat litter, and frankly, it is very similar to cat litter. You can put it in the bottom of basins like this, and they've done one of these on the A30 or the A38. What they didn't know was it floats, so they put it all in the bottom of the basin, and then when it rained and the runoff ran into the basin, the media floated. So you have to put a layer of stone over the top, we discovered. The other problem with the installation they did in Devon was there was unknown to them, there was a local land drainage connection from a local farm, and the farmers spread some slurry and it filled with slurry, which didn't do it any good either. So there's some design considerations to bear in mind for this solution, but it's an option for infiltration. As you guys are on the chalk, then you're going to use infiltration devices, this is quite a good solution to catch that pollution before it reaches the chalk. And when you've done all that, then you can put it in a pond. But please remember to take out the gross pollution before you put it in the pond, because the pond will then do all those magic things that ponds do. So the sunshine will shine and the organic pollutants will break down, the microorganisms will eat the organic things, the plants will take up the nutrients, the metals will assimilate into the sediment at the base of the pond. All those magic processes will happen, but please do treatment first so that this can also be a habitat for wildlife, because these can be beautiful and they can be enormous. So let's get the design right. And like I say, there are opportunities to combine that habitat creation with pollution control, but we've got to be really cautious. So all that was motorways, really, and trunk roads. The reason I focus on those is because national highways have money and because they cause the most pollution. So I justify myself concentrating on those. But you will also be familiar, I hope, with sustainable drainage systems, SUDs. And SUDs are brilliant for all the other roads. So the road outside your house, the road that you go down on the way to school in the morning. And this is the Sheffield Grey to Green scheme. And this SUDS device is an infiltration device. It's a rain garden, and it takes the footpath runoff that you can see in front of you. So there's no curb. That water just runs off that footpath, down that benching and into the bioremediation zone. And on the other side is a road, and the road runoff does exactly the same, straight over the edge of the road, down the benching and into the bioremediation zone. These are magnificent for roads up to about 15,000 annual average daily traffic movements. So local roads, roads in towns and villages, those roads, these are magnificent. And these will catch the pollution because the pollutant load is low. The capacity within that bioremediation zone is enormous. So these will catch that pollution. If you think back to my filter drain, the trick is to spread your pollution out along your device. And that's what they're doing here. They've got this over the edge drainage and it spreads all the pollution across the whole bioremediation zone and you get excellent treatment. There is a little grey zone because I always say anything over 50,000 AADT, annual average daily traffic movements, engineered solutions, the ones I've just gone through. Anything below 15,000, SUDs are fine. There's a bit of a grey zone in the middle where it's relatively site specific. So anything between 15 and 30 that goes to ground on a chalk horizon or a limestone horizon, that needs proper design and proper engineering. If it's 15 to 30 and it goes into a river in Blackburn, SUDs are probably fine. So just be cautious of that grey area in the middle because we've not quite defined it. It is really important that when you're infiltrating runoff, whether it's in a SUD scheme or in a highway treatment scheme, you have to remember groundwater protection. And I have to tell you that the guidance for engineers doing this is a bit rubbish. And so we are not getting, designers are not properly assessing groundwater protection when they're designing treatment schemes for urban runoff. And unfortunately, the Environment Agency doesn't see SUDS designs for water quality. They don't comment on them. They don't, the design doesn't even come to the Environment Agency. The local authority does it on their behalf. National Highways designs don't go to the Environment Agency because National Highways are a significant infrastructure thingamajig, so they do their own sort of consideration and design. And so there's a massive gap where groundwater specialists, who frankly only really exist at the Environment Agency and at some consultancies, are not seeing these designs. And so people are merrily designing infiltration designs. Deep soakage boreholes are still knocking about. Soakage manhole chambers they use on the highway infrastructure. Infiltration SUDs they use everywhere. And groundwater specialists are not seeing those designs. And that's a massive problem in this country at the moment. So we see things like this. This is a swale. Again, really cute, linear device, all the runoff spread along the length of the swale, which is exactly what I want to see. And on that road, which is in Chorley in Lancashire, which is on 15 metres of boulder clay, I don't care. That's fine. The pollution will be captured in the top centimetres of soil. And frankly, if it migrates down into the boulder clay, it's not going anywhere. But if that was on your chalk horizons, I'd be really sweaty because there's no recognition there of whether or not that's going to cause or allow contaminants to migrate down into the chalk. So where groundwater is vulnerable, then the design needs to reflect that. there are things people can do locally to help. The first thing to do is to find your local highway outfalls and get to know them. And that's easier than you might think. The National Highways outfalls are available on the map that was recently published by Watershed Investigations. It's not a complete map, but it's a start. And it's got dots where the outfalls are or might be. It's not as good for soakaways to ground. So on some of your catchments, you might have a problem, but start off by looking at that map. For local roads, where I live, wherever a road crosses a river, there will be an outfall almost always. That's slightly more complicated for you again because you've got an infiltration capability in your chalk. Talk to the local authority and find out how the drainage infrastructure is designed and where it goes. I mean, heaven forbid that there may be some gully pots where it just goes into the gully pot and then just soaks away. And that's something you need to be aware of. The other thing that's really, really powerful is video them or photograph them because they're expensive to sample and we can't all do that. But certainly if you can get a video of a highway discharge discharging, it's a really powerful because it's horrible. It's black and comes thundering out of the pipe when it rains hard. And just a video of that is really powerful imagery to go back to the highway authority and say, look what you're doing to our stream and you need to fix this. Pay particular attention to, as I mentioned earlier, to anything that's discharging into watercourses that are dry in the summer. I think if you found a discharge off the motorway network into a dry chalk stream and you took a sample of it and proved that it had environmental quality standards exceedances in the runoff, I'd be off to the Office for Environmental Protection in a heartbeat with that because the Environment Agency have a duty to regulate those discharges and they're not. And in that instance, that's massively risky. And I think if you can find one of those and I can help you take samples, I'd be hopping up and down. And the other thing you can do is when new road schemes or new road improvement schemes or active travel pathways or roundabout improvements or road widening schemes are going on in your local area, get involved with the planning process. So make a nuisance of yourself. I've just been working with two people in Exmouth over the last 18 months, and they've done exactly that. They've been a pain in the neck of the local authority, but they have completely changed the drainage design on that piece of new road by saying, well, your pond isn't big enough and your suds aren't properly designed and your flow rates aren't right. And they've just kept picking at the drawings and the design which is in the public domain. Honestly, I bet the guy at the local authority hates them, but they've made a massive difference. And that treatment scheme on that new build road will be better because of them. And it will help to protect their stream in their local area. And hurrah for people like that. And then finally, just a note of caution. This stuff is very poisonous. I know it's poisonous to insects, but it's probably poisonous. Well, it is poisonous to us as well. So if you're doing any sampling or investigation, wear gloves, take a friend, wear a life jacket, tell somebody where you're going, all those things that we would normally do if you were going working near water. But the other thing to remember is that particularly for the motorway network, it is illegal to go over the fence into the motorway network. So even if you're at the bottom of the embankment and there's a stream and there's a discharge, you can't go over the fence into there and take a sample. Solution, as far as I'm concerned, is to have a very long sample pole. So I've got a 4 meter sample pole, which means I can take a sample through the fence of the discharge without having to go over the fence. But please don't go stomping about looking for these outfalls and getting yourself into trouble or indeed putting yourself into any danger. The other thing to bear in mind, I haven't talked about swimming. Frankly, you mustn't swim in highway runoff contaminated waters. And people don't generally. People are more focused on sewage when it comes to river swimming. But if you do know of river swimming locally to you, please make sure that it isn't downstream of particularly motorway discharges or very busy road discharges, because if it is, then those toxins and carcinogens that are in this runoff have the potential to cause harm to human health. There's NAFL research, globally there's NAFL research, because it's not really anything we've thought about before, but please be cautious. So I did my miserable bit at the beginning and told you all that this stuff causes pollution. It causes the most horrific harm to aquatic life, but we're not really measuring it because nobody wants to know. We need more research, but we mustn't let the research paralyze us, because that's what we've done for the last 30 years. National Highways just do research and then more research, and then perhaps we should do some more research. And that's gone on for 30 years, and we have to stop paralysing ourselves with research and do some solutions. We need to work out which outfalls to fix first, and that's quite tricky, but you will be very pleased to know that National Highways are now saying that chalk streams will be towards the top of that list, which they've never said before, so that's fabulous news. And we could do with some regulation. So I don't know if there's anybody on the call from the Environment Agency, but we desperately need the Environment Agency to get a grip of this and have a better plan, because they haven't really got one. And then we probably need about 30 billion quid if anybody's got any loose change on the back of the couch. Each scheme on the motorway network will cost about £3 million, and there are 25,000 outfalls. Each scheme on a local authority road might cost, I don't know, 125,000, something like that. A retrofit sud scheme in a local village might cost £75,000. So it's going to cost a lot of money, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. And that's it. And I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm very excited. Somebody said Twitter's dying. We must all go to Blue Sky. So I've got a Blue Sky account now. I'm Stormwater Joe, I think, on Blue Sky. If you're interested in the technical stuff, follow me on LinkedIn, because that's where I do all my technical posts. And we did write a report with CIWEM, the Chartered Institution of Water and Environment Management, in May this year, with all the technical detail about this in it, and the results of all the analysis that we've done and the samples that we've taken. So if you're particularly interested in the science and you want to read more, let me know and I'll send you the link, or I'll send it to Sophie and she can share it with everybody.